if a God is going to appear and give us a revelation, that's sort of an ideal type of revelation. It's an impartial, impersonal, hey, here's what reality is like. I'm going to lay it out for you philosophically. I'm going to prepare you about other people's arguments and how to overthrow them. And I'm going to give it to you. And now you know how it all is. Goodbye.
Yeah.
She's not coming down and saying, I'm your boss and you're going to do this. The reality outside the cave and the reality inside the cave, neither one of them is privileged when it comes to the question of, is there something? Like, is it? Whether it's a simulation, both what is real and what is a simulation is. If you want the broadest metaphysical question, it's that everything is.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching today. Today, I have a very philosophy-interested guest called Adam, and he's also known as Tweetophon in Twitter. We wanted to base this conversation on a question, which is the question of, can we know anything for sure? And connecting it with a universe view, which can be called an ontology. Tell me your initial thoughts about this question and how you've approached learning about the world previously.
Well, first, thanks for having me on. Feel free to call me Adam. That's fine. Like you said, I'm on Twitter as Tweetophon, and there's a website and everything. I try to keep up to date, but Adam is good. In terms of the question you just asked, can we know anything for certain? I think the answer has to be yes, or I want to say I know the answer has to be yes, because sort of anything we say or do, or even if we couldn't do or say anything, just be something, be ourselves or think, or just be aware of our presence. It requires some sort of affirmation or existence, right? There has to be something. And so the very question itself presupposes or necessitates, it's a necessary inference that if you're facing this question, there's a you and there's a question and there's a context for all of that. And so I think you can't really deny it. I shouldn't even say I think you can't deny it. It's just flat out, it can't be denied on pain of contradicting the fact that there's a question, or contradicting the fact that I'm even aware of a question, or that I am. As soon as you recognize that there is a you, or even if you were saying that there's no real you and everything is one, as soon as you have any sort of affirmation, you have to admit that with absolute certainty, because there's really no way to deny it, because in denying it, you're also maintaining it. I mean, there's no way of getting away from it. So yes, I think there is an absolute ground for knowledge or certainty. And that absolute ground for being certain that you know something is being or existence. So I am absolutely confident, I suppose. It's not really something you should say. I am absolutely confident of something. You try to be modest when you talk, right? But on that particular point, can we know anything for certain? Yes, absolutely. You can know that you exist. There's really no alternative, no question of that. And any attempt to question it is really just contradictory. It's incoherent. There's nothing to it. So yes, I would say absolute certainty. Yes, we can know something.
Yeah. That's a really great way to think about this question, I think. Of course, for us to be knowing, there needs to be an entity questioning. And since we are in this process, it's kind of undeniable to try to be figuring out the world and ourselves, while still also denying our existence, at least our existence as a mind. We can deny that this universe is real. We can think of it, it might be real, might be a simulation. Things might be mediated by our senses, so we really never encounter them directly. We can pose many questions and put into question so many things that appear obvious and intuitive. but we can never really throw out the fact that there is a questioner, there is a thinker, and of course there are a few thinkers that come to mind who thought about this. Two of them, Plato, he thought about the allegory of the cave, where he represented the faultiness and the incompleteness of our senses with projections from cutouts of objects in a cave illuminated by a fire. And of course, the people that are chained to this cave, they are looking at what's happening. All their lives, they're only seeing that mediated by the fire and the shadows. So it's intuitive to think that they will believe what they are seeing, what they are perceiving their entire lives is what is real. Also, Descartes, many, many years later, questioned everything. He went on an endless bout of questioning everything he could, but he landed upon one piece of reality that he really couldn't figure out how to put into question, which is the fact that he's questioning things, that he's thinking. And so that's where his most famous thought came about. I think, therefore I am, which is, of course, ludicrous in that order. Of course, he would need to exist to be able to think. We can't let ourselves be so easily deceived. We don't think and then exist afterwards. We need a kind of a substrate or a basis. The logic is much more. It makes much more sense in that direction of induction. So there's some kind of hardware and software working, or rules or whatnot, and then some processes can happen. But I would like to ask you about your worldview, about many things that you studied, since you studied a philosophy that is called, some call it monism, some call it Eleatism.
Eleatic, it refers to certain pre-Socratic thinkers. So you have the major ones, the ones that are most famous that everyone probably knows about, are Parmenides and Zeno. Everyone is essentially going to know those two figures. There's also another pre-Socratic by the name of Melissus. And you can see that there are many other people in this sort of field or doing this sort of thing around the Greek world. It's called Eleatic because of the city of Elea. That's where Parmenides was when this all started with him, I suppose. Although some will say that this tradition starts earlier with a figure named Xenophanes, and even further back than that. That quote comes from Plato, his dialogue, the Sophist. And I have plenty of problems with Plato, but I don't know if I want to infuriate you or your listeners by complaining about Plato.
No,
no,
feel free to diss Plato at your will, because since I studied like 40 or more thinkers, I found faults in all of them. I don't raise any of them to a pedestal. I think all of them are wrong in some sense. So really, feel free to criticize.
Yeah, well, just to the point about the Chinese side, the Chinese philosophy in terms of metaphysics, and maybe I now infuriate Chinese philosophy Twitter, but essentially they don't have a very strong metaphysical tradition until sort of when Buddhism comes over into China. And I suppose now, I'm not saying there was no metaphysics. There's texts like Zhuang Zi and stuff that's talking about epistemology and things like that. But that's really not developed until commentators really start taking these texts in the late Han dynasty and post fall of Han. And they're saying, okay, here's our Chinese tradition of these texts. We're going to be writing these commentaries on them. And we're developing these coherent worldviews that speak to being and knowledge and truth and all those things. So while the time we're talking about, the pre-Socratics, or even if we just run it all the way down to, Alexander the Great, or we'll even go to Julius Caesar or something, there is metaphysical stuff, But in my opinion, it's not very well fleshed out. It's all over the place. There's one or two significant texts that are later commented on. But for me, I never found that Chinese metaphysics that was ancient, in my opinion, being ancient, being like before unification, to be that impressive, right? The scale of the Hellenic texts. But then I found that later in Chinese tradition, late Han, post fall of Han, you have thinkers like He Yan and Wang Bi and others that are writing these commentaries, or Guo Xiang and others. They write these commentaries. I'm like, oh, okay, they're really fleshing out full systems at a metaphysical level. And when I say metaphysics, I mean the broadest or most fundamental aspect of the worldview, the context that within everything else is going to be. And I thought, okay, they're really doing some good stuff here. And I think they were doing it, as a reaction to Buddhism coming in, because they're saying, oh, these Buddhists have these fully developed metaphysical systems about how the world operates or how everything is, not just a political level or an economic level or something. It really is how reality is, trying to describe all of reality in a very holistic sense and having some common, oneness or unity to it all. And so they had to kind of scramble it. I mean, obviously, some of them would take up Buddhism or at least be influenced by it, but also they want to look back to their classical texts and comment on them and see what they can draw out and see what they can piece together. I mean, it's not wrong to imitate, but to kind of develop that sort of holistic, clearly defined, well fleshed out worldview. And so that school, if people want to check it out, I named some names, but it's also Xuan Xue, which is sort of, I guess you'd call it like studying the dark or mystery. Sometimes it's called Neo-Taoism. But another thing to remember is these ancient schools, often when we study ancient Chinese, there'll be, you got like your Confucianists, your legalists, your Taoists, but Tao isn't just restricted to like the term Tao, and people will have studied, they'll be familiar with it themselves, but that term is not just restricted to what we would term Taoist texts like Tao Te Ching or Zhuang Zi or something. Tao will turn up in legalist text. Tao will turn up in Confucius text. Like Xuan Zi or whoever. I mean, Tao is going to be everywhere. So you'll find that these ancient Chinese texts, they do all have like some conversation about Tao or have their own take on it. But I think it's post Han or late Han where they really get fleshed out into these very much clearer and more thought out systems that are more unified. And you'll find that it winds up being very eclectic. So already the ancients were eclectic. I mean, already you'll have Confucius and Mencius and people talking about Tao, even though from a modern perspective, maybe when we go to high school or college, they'll say, this is a Taoist school, this is a Confucius school. And then you'll think, okay, well, the Confucian school will not talk about Tao, or the legalist school will not talk about Tao because Tao is Taoist school. That's not really accurate. And especially by the late or post Han, these thinkers are saying, one of the things they debate is who's the greatest sage. And it'll be a toss up between like a Lao Tzu and Confucius. And they'll discuss the two thinkers' ideas on the Tao. And they'll be quoting these Confucian texts. And so Confucius becomes like a Taoist sage for some of these people, or at least has views on it. They'll be like, I'm going off on a tangent here, but it'll be like, why did Confucius say that this great ancient king could not be described in words? Well, he can't be described in words because when you assign a word to something, you limit it. And this king was so great that he cannot be limited by one compliment. Like you can't say he was clever, because then he's just a clever guy. He's not the strong guy or whatever. So, and if you say clever and strong, well, is he fast? You're always limiting or leaving something out. And so by saying that his greatness couldn't be spoken of, Confucius was this Taoist sage saying this king was so universal or all embodying that he was no particular complement. He was all of them. So now we're getting into when we say talk about being, maybe we're saying being is no more this laptop than it is this microphone or this mug of tea. Because if I said it was a laptop, I'm sort of limiting it or making it only a part of what is. But if I say that is no particular thing, then it is all things. So you'll find that this is actually an interesting side of Chinese philosophy and works, which is why I was starting mostly with pre-unification Chinese works, but then I found there were a lot of nice ones post-unification. And so that's the Chinese side. But Eleatic is regarding Parmenides and the like, to bring it back. As for Plato, all I was going to say right now was, you mentioned the cave, right? And you said maybe the people in the cave are a simulation because there's people behind them or wherever holding up the icons or objects for the fire to cast a shadow on the cave. That's one question, but it's really just, there's two things I would say. One thing I would say is whether it's a simulation or whether it's real, both what is real and what is a simulation is. I mean, we are positing that there are people holding these objects and the fire casting the shadow. That's real. Whether it's a simulation or not, they're simulating movement on the wall by means of this fire. But and the people are looking at that and thinking there's more to it than there really is. But it's still all real. It's just the people who are chained and watching the fire. And I haven't read The Republic in a while, but the people who are chained and watching the fire, they're just trying to build models of what they're viewing and going beyond themselves. You know, it's like if you gave me an apple and then I assume, oh, Rogerio, he has a whole orchard. He has a whole farm full of apples and pears and everything because clearly he's wealthy enough to give me an apple. I've gone beyond what really happened. You just gave me one apple. Why am I making this whole scenario of other things? And maybe I think, oh, he's a magician and he can conjure apples. Like, I haven't got that data. I'm just building a model that really is going beyond what I really know. And so even though these people, in looking at the wall, we can say it's a simulation and they're really giving it more meaning or substance than what they're really receiving. And they think this is their whole worldview and this is how reality is. And the shadows have a mind and these are gods that the shadows are. They're just writing a whole story that's really not justified, but it still is. Just like when someone gets dragged out of the cave or makes their way out of the cave, what's outside the cave also is. And it all equally is. There's the reality outside the cave and the reality inside the cave, neither one of them is privileged when it comes to the question of, is there something? Like, is it? Because clearly they both are absolutely ontologically present. There's no doubt. They just are. We can say that the person outside the cave may have a worldview that is more coherent, contains less contradictions, and then we can get into a discussion of morality and the like about what people ought to do. And maybe the people in the cave have very contradictory and delusional ideas, but the fact that they exist is sort of just equally. There's no more real. And so when we do the thing where we say, oh, maybe this is just a simulation and then something else is real, or maybe it's a simulation, we can never know it's a simulation, it's just kicking the can down the road, because that's really a more narrow question. The real question, if you want the broadest metaphysical question, it's that everything is. Whether it's a simulation or not, it's real. Now, if you want to say, well, maybe it's a simulation, well, okay, but that's a more narrow question where you're just saying within the context of everything existing, maybe there's this little bit here where we're in a computer, and then when we're released from the computer, we'll be over here, like we wake up from the matrix and we're over here in the, whatever happens in the moving matrix when they unplug. I guess they're in like some sort of mechanized world, but it's like the planet Earth has been turned into a computer factory. But we're in the computer here, it's a simulation, and then we can unplug and we'll be in this special world over here. But both the simulation world and the special place that you're suggesting exists, not you, but the speaker is suggesting, both of those exist in a single context and they relate to each other. And it's the context is king. They're both going to obey the context or else be contradictory.
Yeah, this is something that I find really interesting about the Eleatic and Monist worldview, which is to try to figure out an overarching concept that includes everything that you can conceive of, not just stuff that you can touch, hear, taste, and smell, in the physical world, but also anything that you can conceptualize in your mind, entire fictional universes, inventions that might never be even realized physically. And also, so it's a being that is independent of the dimension of time, which is something that I thought really interesting in your worldview, which contrasts a lot with some other guys who talked about flux and stuff changing through time, and they kind of look at only the slice of time in which their universe is, and they think they are convinced that the only thing that exists is the slice of time they are in right now, they are perceiving at that time, and the rest doesn't exist. And I think you want to comment on that as well. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is the major stress point, I think, between some of these thinkers. You mentioned flux, everyone is going to say Heraclitus, but, even if someone really popular who has a well-developed following and set of texts like Aristotle, he's usually interpreted as a presentist. And so this question of presentism, where it's just like you're in this one moment and future moments will come to be, and past moments, there are a couple of options on what becomes of them. Or eternalists, like a block world model. I don't read a lot of the modern literature on this, but I understand that's how they're described, essentially like a block world eternalist model or a presentist model. That's one of the main issues about that are going to determine much of what can be said. It's like a very big contextual issue. Like, what is the context of everything we're about to say? Is it a presentist model or an eternalist model? Aristotle is typically going to be interpreted as a presentist. And if you don't agree with that, if you have an ontology where everything is, you can't accept this sort of metaphysical or chronological coming to be. Like, everything exists. There's no alternate way or state. And so maybe there's a presentist out there who's going to be screaming at his monitor, but if you only have like one way of being, ultimately, like the context is everything, literally everything exists, then chronologically you're going to wind up with an eternalist model. And if you have an eternalist model, nothing is actually being destroyed or going away. There's no new time coming into being. There's no new things coming from nothing, or even being rearranged. For example, there's one thinker that Aristotle hates, is Melissus of Samos. And he specifically says, this debate obviously went on for centuries and still goes on today, where, let's say Parmenides comes onto the scene and says, everything is, and at this metaphysical level, what is isn't becoming or being destroyed or whatever. And then some clever clogs comes along and says, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say that there is this fundamental atoms, or some Anaxagoras with his seeds, or whoever, Empedocles with his elements and things. I'm going to make these fundamental building blocks that are unchanging and can't be destroyed. And then I'm going to arrange them in different ways to make new things, sort of like a nominalist position. And so these little fundamental building blocks are going to obey that injunction against becoming and being destroyed. But if I move them around with these new arrangements, I'm not destroying, I'm not adding anything, but I'm rearranging. And now the new rearrangements create new meaning. And then Melissus comes along and says, it doesn't really solve the problem at all, because where's the meaning coming from? Where's the arrangement coming from? Because if the arrangement of something has significance and the new arrangement has new significance, something is still becoming. Like, that new significance was not there initially. And now it's supposed to be becoming. So even if you have this fundamental substance, like a physical substance or some sort of matter or whatever we want to posit, you're not really answering or solving the problem, because now you've just said, okay, well, the matter is not going to be destroyed or become, but now we've got the meaning level, and this is full of becoming. And it's like, well, the matter and these forms, or whatever we're going to call them, the arrangements, or the meaning coming to be from the new rearrangements of the underlying matter, this is all happening in the context of being. Both of them are. And so this side is still violating what we just said. There only is what is, and there's nothing to be said about what is not. And actually, what is not is ultimately just gibberish. And so if what is at time one has this arrangement and this meaning, and time two is supposed to have a new arrangement or new meaning, something different, then what is different, what time two is adding to the picture, is a becoming. And we need to posit that just like we need to posit time one. It cannot be a becoming, it has to already be there. So it has to be a block world, basically. And so Aristotle hates that guy, but basically that debate has been going for so long, and sadly the classical works, so many of them are fragmentary or lost. So it's unfortunate, but there's enough there that you can flesh out a lot of the debates, or at least see different ways it could have gone, and it's very interesting. And so I think that question about presentism and internalism, huge question today. Apparently, I haven't read a lot of the modern literature, but I think it is incredibly important, because whatever context we posit, it's going to have a lot of ramifications all the way down. And so for me, it led to me saying essentially, Aristotle's incorrect. His metaphysics is broken. I don't agree with Aristotle anymore. And similarly, I don't agree with I can't be joining certain religions or schools of thought, because they have teachings that I think violate these broader metaphysical principles. And as a result, I think they're incoherent. Because you were saying that Eleatic philosophy is about saying the broadest possible thing. And I think that's correct. They're trying to identify the broadest, reality is essentially for them one thing. It's like there's nothing beyond it, because that would be a contradiction.
It's like this. It's like this, It's the entire thing that encapsulates. It's the set that contains all sets and is not contained by anything.
Yeah, I've heard that phrase a lot. The set of all sets. I've never studied set theory, but some people will listen to me and say, "Oh yeah, the set that encompasses all sets." But the one question they also ask is, it becomes difficult to think of it as well. Like let's not go to the Chinese thinkers right now. So Melissus and Parmenides, right? Parmenides is going to say this whole or this being is complete, it's perfect, and it's finite, because it just is what is and nothing else, and nothing beyond it. It's a complete thing, and in being complete, he conceives of it as finite, because it's all set in stone. And so if it wasn't set in stone, if new things are coming in, that would be incomplete. But if it is complete, then it's all there, it's that, nothing more, nothing less, so it's finite. That gets into a debate about infinities and finite things. That's a whole different way of interpreting it. I would say when reading these texts, people should not, there are different ways of thinking of unlimited or infinite. I mean, the term is usually going to be unlimited when it's translated, but it's not always as it first seems. They should read it in its context and think about it. But so Parmenides is saying it's finite, and then Melissus is going to say it's infinite, right? Or unlimited. And his thinking is, to be limited, to have a limit, means that you are being bordered on by something, or there's something external to you that's limiting against you. So for example, I'm limited, there's a computer that's apart from me, there's other things apart from me. But if I was unlimited, that would just mean that's the end of the question. There's nothing to say about my limit, because there's nothing beyond me that would press against me or say this is where Adam cuts off and the new thing is, or this is where the idea of Adam ends and there's another idea there. Limit requires plurality, because limit requires, in his philosophy, again, when we're saying unlimited, infinity, think about the context and the speaker. Don't just take a modern definition or your favorite definition and impose it onto him and then say, well, given my personal definition or a modern definition, or even Aristotle's definitions or whatever, your system doesn't work anymore. It's not going to work like that. But think about what they're trying to say. I think what Melissus is saying when he says that being is unlimited, whereas Parmenides says it was limited, now Melissus is saying being is unlimited because in Melissus's conception, limit requires some other thing to be referenced. So I am limited and I know this because there are things beyond me. Whereas being is unlimited because there's nothing to cite beyond it. There just is what is, and it's unlimited because there is no other thing that could draw a border around it and be on the other side.
Yeah.
So I think almost you have there, I'm going off on a tangent, but almost you have there is Parmenides saying it's limited, Melissus saying it's unlimited or finite and infinite. But really, there's a way of allowing them to cohere or be saying somewhat similar things from different perspectives.
And to you, to you, you ascribe more to Melissus's view in terms of it being unlimited?
I think they, well, Melissus certainly added a lot to Eleatic thought and also took it in a particular direction that, so just to back up, when we read Parmenides, there's a lot of commentators, there's a lot of, I mean, everyone from Plato, Aristotle, down to like, you mentioned you like to read late Roman stuff, so if you have like, Simplicius is, I mean, basically like medieval almost. And I'm sure medieval, I don't read much medieval, but I'm sure they commented on it as well. There's plenty of thinkers that have commented on Parmenides and come up with interpretations. And so not all of them are going to be anything resembling what I've said. So, you know, there's a modern professor who's alive today, Professor, what's her name? Patricia McCurd. I hope I didn't butcher it, but she essentially, I think, interpreted Parmenides as simply describing the necessary details of an atom. So she has a more atomist position, or basically Parmenides, the goddess, it's a revelation. So the goddess is telling Parmenides whatever the fundamental substance or aspect of reality is, these are the things that have to be said about it. Like these are the things that are true about it, whatever it is. And so almost like little building blocks. And these little building blocks have to meet this criteria. Another way of interpreting it is the way I interpret it, which is being is one thing, and he's describing this one thing. And Melissus is going to go down that track. But you also have like a Simplicius who is going to say something like Parmenides is putting a shadow world and a world of what is. And the the shadow world, and so you also have like a dualistic system, which I would not adopt. But yes, when I say I like Melissus, I like that particular strain or direction of thought. But I don't necessarily say Melissus is better than Parmenides. I mean,
yeah,
they both bring a lot to the table, and they clearly, it's it's funny in the history. It's not clear they ever met or anything like that, and it's not clear to what extent the Eleatic school was a school. You know, there were these thinkers. Melissus is on the east side of the Mediterranean. Parmenides is in Italy. They clearly both have followers or disciples, and they spread out throughout the Hellenic world. And you can see why they're compared to each other. And Melissus is born later, so presumably he read Parmenides or was familiar with him, but to what extent we can't say. But I think that they're both very valuable, and I tend to go with that more Melissian interpretation. Although again, Melissus has other interpreters, but I think he kind of is very clearer. He's much clearer in his way of speaking than Parmenides, who writes a poem and receives a revelation from the goddess and is difficult to understand. And there are many alternative translations.
Yeah, I find the poem a bit amusing because there are many instances in history when thinkers state a fact, and they say it is divinely inspired as a means to back that statement up. And so maybe I'm kind of intrigued if it was his idea to bring a little bit more solidity to his argument of the one and stuff, to use the poetry and the saying that it was divinely inspired to kind of be convincing to his potential followers. It probably would be at the time a really good sales pitch, because let's see the context. There were schools, philosophy schools, that were competing with each other. They were kind of businesses. I'm not so sure if at the time of Parmenides per se they were quite as business-like as during Aristotle's time, which is much more clear to me that they were competing. But it kind of seems like he was showing things. Yeah,
I don't know if it's big business. It's not like that. Maybe more like I don't want to say monastic living, but I mean, there were philosophical communities. The one at Elea is going to be like that. You got Pythagoras is more famous for that. but they definitely competed. They knew of each other. I mean, if you read Heraclitus, he references Pythagoras, Xenophanes, and two others, and says unkind things about at least Pythagoras in another one, but basically saying, these guys learn a lot of stuff, but it doesn't give them understanding. And he's a little harder on some of them than others, but they're definitely competing in a sense. They're criticizing each other and putting forward their worldviews. So even though they're spread out, you do have that. Whether Parmenides is trying to do a marketing strategy, I don't know. I tend to just, if he wants to say a goddess came and visited him, that's fine. When I was talking about earlier, I couldn't join certain religions because I believe metaphysics is broader than theology, and I believe that theology would be in contradiction to the metaphysics. With a polytheistic, or just saying that there's like a god that comes and visits you, that doesn't really violate the metaphysics. I might not understand where the god came from, and maybe the person's lying, but there's nothing contradictory about saying that a very powerful entity walked into this room and said, "Hey, Adam, this is how it all is." That's fine. Maybe it's an alien. I don't know, but the contradiction only arises when we try and assign them certain properties or abilities that are not coherent, like creation. So Parmenides isn't saying the goddess visited me and said, "I, the goddess, created reality from nothing or from myself, and I can arrange new meaning that was not." Like, she's not saying that. She's just saying there is what is, and that's what we talk about. And you can't talk about what is not, because that's just gibberish. There's nothing to be said about it. It's nothing. If he made it up, he made it up. And you're right, there's a tradition of poetic, there's a poetic history of the Iliad and Hesiod and others. So clearly Parmenides would have been exposed to such things, like writing a story about gods and muses and things. And he could write it in that format. I don't think anyone would think of him as a great epic poet. It's just sort of the style he adopted. But I don't think it necessarily, I would accuse him of marketing. Maybe, there were religious communities all over the Mediterranean world. And maybe he had maybe his settlement or where he was living, they had the religious community, and it was kind of both philosophy and religion. And maybe they did have, one thinker, I forget his name, there was a find. It dates to centuries after Parmenides, but basically they dug up a statue, and this bust or statue or whatever it was has a term on it that it's identified as Parmenides, and it has written on it a healer or dream healer or something like that. I forget it. It's like a 2nd century or 1st century find, but the one writer, again, I'm blanking on his mind. He essentially wrote, "Hey, maybe Parmenides was one of the priests in one of these like dream cults. You can go in, you have a dream, and then in the dream you will be told whatever you need to know, or maybe you'll be healed or told what medicine you need to take or whatnot." And so they'd have like a special temple and certain rituals and things, and then you could go there and you could sleep there, and then someone would come and meet with you and interpret your dream. So maybe Parmenides was like a one of these priests, and maybe he was met by, maybe he believes he was met by this entity.
He could have been a part of a dream that he was trying to interpret by himself or with help. And so there are many possible explanations, and we would be kind of foolish to attach ourselves to one of them.
I like it, his work. As far as revelations go, I like it as far as revelations go, because the goddess is not really claiming any special position or authority or power. She's actually putting forward an account of reality, or essentially a metaphysical account of what is. And so, if a god is going to appear and give us a revelation, that's sort of an ideal type of revelation. It's an impartial, impersonal, hey, here's what reality is like. I'm going to lay it out for you philosophically. I'm going to prepare you about other people's arguments and how to overthrow them. And I'm going to give it to you. And now you know how it all is. Goodbye.
Yeah.
So she's not coming down and saying, I'm your boss and you're going to do this. She's just saying, this is reality. Let me lay it down on you, philosophically. And I'm not going to invoke myself as the authority. I'm actually just going to say, these are the requirements for coherence, and here's how you can explain that. So revelation wise, it's very philosophical or very appealing. And to Melissus, I mean, we were talking about him earlier. We said there were three main Eleatics, pre-Socratic, right? Zeno and Melissus being the others. They don't really talk about the gods as far as we can tell. Melissus, there's no gods in his work. It's a very sort of, it's like almost like a modern essay, a very succinct, modern, logically flowing essay that doesn't really flesh out too much like you might see in like a journal article or something, but it's just, there's no poetry to it. It's not like a poem. There's no characters. There are a couple of allusions, like you'll talk about a ring being worn down. So there's some physical allusions or analogies, but generally speaking, it's a very dry, forward, it's in fragments, but we'll call it an essay or pamphlet.
Yeah.
So if you want to avoid the gods and still have Eleatic philosophy, you can go with Melissus, and Zeno's paradoxes don't require any gods, although usually we say Achilles and the tortoise, right? I guess Achilles is semi-divine, but generally speaking, you don't need gods for Eleatic faith or
Sure.
belief or philosophy.
You reminded me of another instance in history, in another land, where such a similar thing happened. It was in the case of a man that was basically, he never was formally trained in mathematics. His name was Ramanujan, and he was born in India. I think as the part of the priestly class, the Brahmins. He showed immense innate prowess in mathematics, and he said that it was due to his some kind of divine revelation. So regardless of the veracity of the divine revelation, the fact is that the man really solved mathematics problems that were thought unsolvable during his time at Cambridge with Dr. Roger Penrose. His life was really shortened due to tuberculosis, but still, it kind of reminded me of Parmenides' story. He could have been perhaps previously only dedicated to priestly services. Perhaps he didn't go into philosophy at first, maybe.
Yeah, it's almost like we can craft our own biography of Parmenides' life, because the fragments and the actual information available is so limited and at times contradictory. So there are multiple accounts of how Parmenides came to be where he wound up, but there are also very limited accounts too. So there's so much we don't know about their day-to-day life or where they grew up and things like that. And even if we do have a fragment that attests to something about it, it's not absolutely certain. I mean, the author is going to be centuries later, and maybe there's another fragment that contradicts him as well. So, but I mean, the guy you were mentioning, who said that he had a divine revelation for mathematics, there's also there's nothing that makes it literally impossible. I mean, the idea that there are aliens, or the idea that someone could contact us in our dreams, like, that's not literally impossible. It's not clear that that's incoherent, or we might not believe it, but I hesitate to say that I can identify a contradiction. And if I can't identify a contradiction, then I have to sort of step back and say, well, maybe it's possible.
Yeah.
And of course, if it's possible, it's necessary, and it would happen. Of course, I can say that I'm uncertain of it, but I would hesitate to say that it's incoherent or impossible for a god to do such a thing, or for a god to be, if it's that limited sort. And and when you talked earlier, like at the beginning of the conversation, about the sense perception and whether we can rely on it or trust it, maybe the mind is a kind of sense. We we're interacting with all these ideas and things, maybe there is some sort of sense aspect to it, and it can interact with not just ideas but also maybe other minds, maybe I'm going too far out on a limb to kind of defend
Sure.
Parmenides writing about goddesses, but
I wanted also to address another point, which is, since you conceive of an ontology, of a worldview that includes all space and time, all ideas that can never come about from minds, all of that is quite awe-inspiring. It's quite awesome. And
yeah.
so anything that, any idea, any concept, any physical thing, it will necessarily need to be contained within
Oh
being.
yeah, right. Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Then it's, well, I think earlier we said something like we sort of bent Pindar's words and said context is king, right? If you are positing a bunch of stuff that are all in a certain context, and they all have to obey that context, or at least comply with that context, or else it just turns into contradiction or gibberish. I mean, the context is saying, here's what is possible, here's what can be said. And then if you go and break that context, it's a contradiction. You broke the system, and the thing that you're positing in that system can't be in that system. And so the context is king, and everything in it, yes, has to comply with it, which is why we wind up with things like an eternalist model. That's why we would deny certain religious teachings. It's why we would, it has a lot of ramifications down the line. It'll inform what we think about life and death. It's going to think about many things. The context is king and is providing this limitation, or this understanding of what is possible. If you don't have a context, then I think at that point you're confused, and if you're breaking the context, you're just contradictory. You're ultimately just talking gibberish. You have to have that context and be consistent with it,
Yeah.
or else you're going to fall into contradiction or just be spouting gibberish. And
sure.
With and yeah, you're right, anything is going to have to kind of bow down, or at least fit within that. And so it is awe-inspiring, and it does affect the way that you think about everything. Because if someone comes along and says something that breaks the context, they have to either build a new context that could accommodate it, or just fall into sort of nonsense. It's like,
Yeah.
now when we say break it and make a new context, the reason why being is so awe-inspiring or impressive, and you were mentioning, it contains everything, or it subsumes everything, or it is everything, and there's nothing beyond it. We get to that question, which I think is really important. Can we propose any alternative? Like, is it really all-encompassing? Is there another category or anything like that? Is there something beyond what is? And my position is, any attempt to posit an alternative, any attempt to posit something beyond that metaphysical category of isness, or having ontological presence, or any sort of a presence or affirmation, any attempt to break that sort of worldview or context is immediately just gibberish. It's impossible. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
It's like if we define being as all that is, and then we say there's a beyond being, well, we're affirming something beyond being. And by definition, being encompassed everything that has any sort of presence. So your beyond being is inside being. And
it's like they're trying to play rock, paper, rock, scissors, and they're always playing rock, and you have paper always, and
yeah,
paper
you always have paper.
just encapsulates everything. As it's impossible to play scissors because it's impossible to break the
but
model.
sometimes a person plays rock and you play paper, and they say, no, I played scissors.
Yeah.
You have to explain to them, look,
yeah,
although it looks like a scissor, it's actually a rock. So that's where I guess a lot of online arguments happen, right? It's trying to discuss whether or not the person really played a rock or a scissor.
Yeah.
But and I believe that causes a lot of people to wind up following worldviews or accounts that are incorrect, and they may spend a lot of time fleshing them out. Like obviously Aristotle spent his whole life fleshing out and teaching his position on what reality is. I'm sure there are many Thomists and others who spend tremendous amounts of time on it. And I think, sadly, their understanding of the context is either incomplete or incorrect. And therefore, much of what they say is just incorrect.
Yeah, there's some point where you connect the dots and figure out nonsense. There's some nonsense in there. But even if there's some nonsense in thinking of, for example, Aristotle, still there's some value in terms of lifestyle and good practices, lifestyle habits of life to be found in Nicomachean Ethics. It's a big text to be frank, but
there's a lot of value in that. I like the Nicomachean Ethics. I have disagreements with some of it. I don't think the good should be thought of as an end, but I think Aristotle wrote a lot of good stuff. And a lot of the stuff there is important for our understanding of classical antiquity. I mean, Xenophon did the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, but Aristotle does the Constitution of Athens, right? And he did his politics, and he's got, and he also raised questions that later, I think, were answered by other people, like whether a sea battle will happen tomorrow, the question of future indeterminates, which gets picked up by figures like Diodorus Cronus and others. So I don't want to say Aristotle wasted his time on everything. I just ultimately, it's like if you're on a journey and you set out from your driveway in your car and you take a right turn when you should have taken a left, and you keep following it to the right, you might see many great things, and maybe you catch sight of the destination every so often, but you went the wrong way early on, and it kind of bled into everything. And so if the overall context has some sort of fundamental error, it's not that you can never say anything good or interesting. Maybe the context was correct enough for you to get a really strong grasp on human ethics or something like that.
Yeah.
But there's this real problem right at the start of your journey.
But it's just like it's only this instead of this,
Yeah, exactly. And and it's like, if you want to go back to Chinese philosophy, there's a well, I won't get into debate about when it was written, but Xuan Zi, there's a text called the Xuan Zi, and essentially a minister is advising the king, and they're building a stable, or he's talking about building a stable for horses. And Guanzhong, the minister, says, if you start building with rotten wood, you have to finish with rotten and warped wood, right? Because you can't have like warped and bad wood to start building construction, then put in straight, healthy planks. You just finish it with the materials that you started building it with. And if you start building with the straight, nice planks, you don't put in some warped and rotten planks. It's just the building's not going to work. Yeah. So you have this sort of start with the good planks, you can finish with the good planks, and it's going to look nice. Start with the warped, rotten wood. The nice planks aren't going to line up. It's not going to work. Just you got to finish it with the materials you started with. And so if your context is bad, you got to keep with the context, and it's going to turn out the way it turns out.
That's a really interesting metaphor, because I really dabbled in the modern philosophers, but I quickly turned to ancient philosophers to figure out more basic and more primitive stuff, or more essential stuff. And this was because I had the notion that almost all modern philosophers base themselves heavily on some or many or several ancient philosophers. And they gave me a sense that they were missing stuff or had stuff wrong really substantially. And if it were not the case, we would have a much more ideal society. More recent philosophy might be a good analysis of language or logic or whatnot, but it is quite exuberant, that it doesn't make humans or give humans a manual to live a good life, or live a life free of stress or injustice and whatnot. I was kind of trying to aim at that. so it seems that the more recent philosophers from the Enlightenment, for example, they might have some stuff correct, but maybe they are kind of like the rotten planks of wood, and they are kind of basing themselves in some stuff that might be more high quality, but in the end the stuff doesn't work really well. And so I prefer to go back and try to figure out by myself whether some stuff that the ancient people were writing down and teaching each other had more fundamental and useful content or ideas
Well,
about
the
human
challenges as
nature
well.
and the functioning of the cosmos that could be really be something of use.
The challenge, though, is one, we have to interpret those ancient thinkers, and two, they, to whatever extent it's accurate, had these competing schools of thought, right? So you wind up having to pick sides anyway and having to interpret them in some way or another. So it's almost like the ancients are these often, well, I don't want to say they're very well written or not, because taste differs, but they're very inspiring texts. And there's a whole array of ideas. And so there's something there that's going to inspire you. And they're much more accessible or easier to read, in my opinion, than modern texts. I think they just get to the point. I mentioned that you find all this inspiration in the ancient texts, so you want to go back and figure it out yourself and lay out a context for the rest of your thought. But one difficulty is, of course, interpreting them. Two is they at times contradict or disagree with each other. So ultimately, you're going to have to take a position. But I think the ancients are a great place to start because they really do spend a lot of time talking about fundamental or contextual questions. They try and set out a context for everything else they're going to say a lot of the time. And there's just so many possibilities that you would never encounter today necessarily in a modern setting. And either because they seem ridiculous or they're unspeakable today, or because they're not popular today. And it's just like a whole new world of all these things. Like I was mentioning the pre-Socratics. How do we usually get them presented to us initially when we're young? Kind of like a meme, sort of like how Aristotle presents them. I don't think Aristotle is a very fair historian about other philosophical thinkers. But it's like, oh, this guy thinks everything is fire. This guy, everything is water. This guy, it's kind of, you would never have a modern teacher come up to you and say, hey, the world's all made of water. And then now let's discuss what it means to be a fluid or a water or something and have an in-depth discussion about that. You just wouldn't encounter it. But even if you didn't agree, it would still be kind of inspiring and interesting. And then you walk down the hallway and it's like, oh, this guy was a student of the water guy. And he says everything comes from the unlimited. And so the unlimited is like this primordial goo or something, and things come forth from it and create the material world. And whatever comes forth comes into elements, and the elements come into us. And then in time, they disintegrate, and they disintegrate, break down into the elements again, and then go back to the primordial unlimited goo or whatever. And so you would never really have, at least I don't think, I didn't take a degree in, I don't even know if there exists a degree in pre-Socratic philosophy, but I just never really had such interesting positions and so in such variety presented to me. And not even if it was done in that way to you today, the people presenting it don't actually believe it. Whereas these ancient people really did believe it. I mean, that was their teaching. And maybe they're wrong or not, but it's just such an inspiring array of positions. So many really fundamental and important arguments, and presented by people that actually believe them. And you can't necessarily get that easily today.
Even people that kind of didn't just talk their talk, they also walk the walk. Kind of like Socrates, he was talking about ethics, but he also lived an arguably ethical lifestyle. Which really strikes a lot of people as interesting when they are only exposed to the more academic way of philosophy of nowadays.
Socrates as well said he had a God speak to him, right? I mean,
exactly,
or whatever. Yeah. So, but go on.
Also, it's as you said, there are many things in which they disagree, of course, but it was striking to me to find both East and West people from ancient times, basically saying that self-improvement is key. Self-improvement is the most important investment in your life. This I heard from followers of Siddhartha, of Confucius, Lao Tzu, the Miyamoto Musashi from Japan as well, much more recent, but still, and the Greco-Hellenic world, basically the most esteemed and most eminent thinkers, they would really highlight the importance of practicing what you preach, of editing your habits to have not just a more healthy lifestyle that supports a good body and mind, but also cultivating yourself, your mind, and possibly your truer self, whatever that means, soul, consciousness, whatever. But I thought it really striking because they were kind of, by reading all these different thinkers, they were kind of reinforcing this concept in my own mind.
Yeah, I think we are humans and we have to, self-improvement is kind of like a you get those self-help books and things like that from the modern bookstores, but the no, you have to learn how to be a human and what it means to be what we are, because we're not something else. We're not disembodied being. I mean, I am Adam, I'm a person, and I have to understand my capabilities and try and do well, because if I don't do well, I'm not going to be experiencing any good things. And so these ancient thinkers do spend a lot of time. Eleatics do not. Just to be clear, Eleatic authors, pre-Socratic Eleatics, they're not spending a lot of time on ethics, at least in the fragments we have. It's pure metaphysics. But we talked about Aristotle and others. Yes, absolutely. They're trying to lay out a moral framework, and then also a biological framework and an account of how organisms change or operate, and then tell you, like, you are this sort of animal or thing, you have these strengths or attributes, and this is how you ought to be. And if you are that way, you'll experience the better things in your life. And metaphysics is fine. It can calm your emotions. It can give you a great context for understanding everything, but it's also very impractical. I'm not going to get a job as a metaphysician talking about being. I mean, maybe some students would pay a professor to do that, but it's not going to essentially be a job for everyone. There's only so many religious aesthetes who can only talk about being and never worry about anything else. And they're not going to have a family or anything like that, because then they're going to learn some practical skills. And so you're absolutely right. There's a whole slew of ancient philosophers who spent far more time on ethics and trying to have a moral context, a social context, and telling people, practice your philosophy and figure out how to be what you are, how to learn about yourself, know yourself, essentially is going down that road, right? That's from the Temple of Delphi.
Yeah.
Know yourself. By knowing what you are and about yourself, you know how to be and what you ought to do and your proper place. And so that's practical. That's the other side.
There's also kind of an important connection between metaphysics and ethics, I think, which is metaphysics is concerned with describing the stage as if we are using a theater metaphor, while ethics is concerned with telling how the actors should act. And by bringing these two things together, by knowing the stage and knowing how to act on it, one thing I think reinforces the other. If you don't have a really self-consistent worldview, someone can more easily fool you with a worldview that is full of inconsistencies. And it's like Voltaire said once: if people can make you believe in absurdities, they can make you do atrocities. And so if you arrive at a really self-consisting worldview that stands to the test of time, people tried to disprove it and failed, and so by default it's really strong, it's surpassed other models, it's more resilient. than other models, then I think it's a good ground to stand on to develop more things like ethics and and logics.
So what I tried to do is, I was saying the Eleatics are really focused on being and laying out that very, very broad context. But obviously, if we're going to have a goddess visiting Parmenides, or if Melissus is going to be arguing with people in the Eastern Mediterranean or wherever he went around arguing, you need a context for that as well that kind of constrains that and explains, what these actors can do and what they are and things like that. And so I agree. You also have ethics where you are making judgments about what a person should do in a particular situation, but you also need a stage set for that. And that's what I don't necessarily call that metaphysics, because metaphysics I think of extremely broad, far broader than whatever stage would be set for human activities. But then there still needs to be a limited context for each of those particular normative judgments. So person eating a hamburger, is that good, evil, whatever? If you found a child down a well and you help them get out of the well, is that good or evil? There needs to be some way of making those normative judgments. So you also need a context for that. So not only do you have the broadest context of being, all these other sciences or fields of expertise or inquiry, they need their context within that broader context. And so the broadest context informs their context. And I sort of view it as getting into more limited and specific contexts all the way down. And then you can answer those ethical questions. And so to your point about combining ethics and metaphysics, I usually phrase it as morality being the system or the context for all of those normative ethical judgments. That's just the language I use. I see people online sometimes say meta ethics. I think they mean the same thing I mean when I say morality. I haven't engaged with them enough to know, but I think that they're talking about a system within which all these judgments are going to come forward. And so obviously Aristotle does that. He has his meta ethics or morality that will then inform the ethical judgments. And I think that is sorely lacking in modern politics or any sort of modern discussion or thing I see on the television or anywhere else. It's sort of people will be very focused on the normative judgment itself, like guns are bad or guns are good, or abortion good, abortion bad. Some of them will have a morality or a meta ethics, which is sort of why I can be impressed by or I can appreciate, like Christians, for example. I may not, like, let's say Catholics, for example. I may not agree with their theology or metaphysics. I think they're wrong on some very fundamental questions. But they have a priest class and people who like to read their old texts and about their worldview. They do have this desire to build a stage for their ethical decisions that informs what they do. They do want that worldview and they do want to be good. And so that's a group that I disagree with, but I think it's very impressive that they at least have that mindset and you can engage with them. Whereas if you don't do this, it's like two sides screaming at each other. It's like ban all guns for everyone, or everyone should have all the guns. And then, okay, well, what is the context or system that we're making this judgment in? Well, guns hurt people. Okay, but why is hurting people bad? Well, it kind of falls apart. They haven't thought any deeper.
Yeah.
Whereas there are groups that have thought deeper, like Catholics or like these ancient philosophers and like various groups. Even if I disagree with many of them, they've thought about it. And I think that is a really important step up, is trying to get that worldview. And that's why I think philosophy is so crucial or important. It's just nothing is good. There's going to be no understanding without context. Understanding requires context. And if you can't broaden your mind or elevate yourself to the point where you're thinking about the context that informs these very practical day-to-day judgments or political decisions, then you are just wishy-washy. There's nothing certain about you. There's no persistent standards and nothing informing you. It's just like you're almost like an animal.
Yeah. This reminds me of a nice example, where context really shines. There's this game creator, Will Wright, who created the SimCity and many other games.
Okay, yeah,
Simulation games, and he made the game to be only winnable, typically, if you avoid the extremes. If you are like right leaning all the way and play it full right leaning and just ignore the context and one size fits all right leaning policies, it will break and you will end up pretty bad, in a bad situation. And the same thing for just being left oriented, etc. But if the player kind of looks at what's going on, does this situation call for is more suitable, a left-leaning policies is more suitable for this situation, or a right-leaning? And if you are called to think about these things in context, you're kind of developing, I think, more excellence in politics, in government, instead of just mindlessly applying an algorithm that came from either Marx or the right-leaning guys, or the libertarians, or free market neoliberals, whatever. We need to think about the context and apply rationality instead of just mindlessly executing code, basically.
No, I think gaming is a great hobby. Maybe it's not that popular, but I've been playing video games for a long time. I enjoy them. I sort of wound up with a certain set of tastes, and I think the most important thing is, everyone always says moderation, but if you have a game where you learn the system and you figure out ways to make things possible, or to make achievements, or to do things that would not have been possible or achievable if you're playing in a mindless fashion or just grinding. I don't like the idea of games where you just grind for the next level or something, and you do something repetitive over and over again. I don't like, say, first-person shooters either, where it's just very action-based and you just want a high kill count. I can see that the good players figure out the points on the map that are good for them and all that. Okay, that's creative, that's intelligent. You're figuring out, strategizing,
optimizing.
Yeah, optimizing. This is all good. And so then it's just a little bit of a taste difference where I don't like that style of game, but I can see it has value. But when it becomes very repetitive and very time consuming, and just there's nothing new intellectually and nothing deep intellectually about it, then no. But SimCity, I played that the original in SimCity 2000 ages ago. But I have to confess, I was much younger then, and I think I just enjoyed building the city and then calling in the disasters. So I would just
you would sandbox. Yeah, a sandbox kind of experience.
I would just destroy the city.
Just experimenting. Yeah, of course.
Well, I was not so much experimenting for success. I was experimenting for to see how big the fire could be in the city block,
Yeah, so. Exactly. Well, this is a really telling thing. That's it's much more exuberant and much more prevalent typically in our earlier years. We kind of have a more acute sense of curiosity that in many persons, it just goes away, and they kind of by default, they start believing that the mind they formed in early adulthood will accompany them to the end of their lives. This is a bit like the ancients thinking that the gods were responsible for the yields. And then Thales just figures out that it's not the gods, it's the weather, and buys all the olive presses, and makes a ton of money. And he just basically games the system, as we were mentioning in video games, but he did this in real life, just to show that if you realize, if people are consistently blind in one domain, and you realize this blindness, and you realize how things really work, people can basically game the system and make a lot of profit, or do something game changing, or do something groundbreaking, or whatnot. But it's really telling, by contrast, by looking at ancient thinkers, that they had many things, despite the lack of technology, of digital technology we have. They had a lot of concepts going nicely for them that we lack today. There were people that were almost immune to negative thoughts and anxiety and stress, which is something that's kind of epidemic nowadays. Most people are not really resilient in that regard. I found that, for example, the Stoics were very adept at implementing lifestyle habits to become calmer even in the face of adversity, and to, even though the emotions are there all the same, but at
Yeah,
least
they definitely had emotions.
yeah,
They could definitely.
Marcus Aurelius wept when his beloved master died and when his kids died and whatnot, but he recovered from the grief much more quickly than other people who would be grieving for months, and then another Stoic, Seneca, would send them letters of consolation to try to get them out of this grief-stricken state. And so, of course, yes, we cannot evade our human nature, but we can figure out the defects in our human nature, as it were, kind of like the crookedness of our minds that we are born with, that might be further twisted by society in some regards. Of course, not everything is bad. There are good things in society, but to some extent, there's a lot of self-improvement stuff that were kind of present in the ancient times. There were philosophy schools very much associated with gymnasiums, and people would exercise their mind and body kind of like at the same time, and they would compete with each other to figure out how to be more calm, how to deal better with stressful situations. In a sense, how to act well in this setting, in this stage that was given to us. That, of course, metaphysics, like from Parmenides and the other Eleatics and many others that they try to describe, we can perhaps take some inferences from how the world works to figure out how we work, because we are part of the world necessarily. And if we produce self-help books that are kind of like these that are existing nowadays, many of them really don't work. They are just telling people what they want to read or what they want to hear, because the main goal or maybe the function of these books is to make a lot of money, first and foremostly. And they kind of, if they were successful in improving people's lives, I think society would be much better by now, and it's not. So perhaps a lot of work needs to be done in the self-development field that is more based in fundamentals that really work.
I think I think we have a tool. You mentioned the digital world. I think things like Twitter and online forums and the like, and YouTube channels like your own, are an amazing resource if we use it right. I mean, here is an ability, geography aside, where, or geography disregarded, because we can all connect wherever we are. The two of us are on other sides of the world right now, essentially. And you can interact with anyone of any background. There's some language barriers. It depends what languages you speak. Translation services are not, like, automatic ones are not that great, or if they are, they're expensive. But it's just like, we don't need an agora in every single city where all the thinkers come into Athens, let's say in the 4th century, and they all hash it out at the houses of aristocrats or in the agora or wherever. No, we have forums dedicated to philosophical topics, or even just gaming with a philosophical side forum, a sub forum. We have YouTube channels we can access for free and we can be on. And we have Twitter where you can just sign up and meet a whole bunch of people, go to their Discord or wherever. The Agora is now international, and everyone is signing up to certain schools or any sort of young person who has any interest in the world or wanting to understand things is going online, finding themselves attracted to some school of thought that they may leave later, like you said, but signing up and essentially not just reading a self-help book or an ancient book, but also being able to come and discuss it and argue it and find something new and maybe change their mind, or at least become intellectually engaged. It's not perfect yet, but I think that this is a really interesting development. So when I was younger, I didn't have the internet. I had it in my teenage years is when I first got the internet and went to internet forums. And you just encounter so many more people who are willing to talk about things that you never talked about before. And it's like a very amazing sort of environment if done well, for just developing worldviews and for practicing philosophy. And the challenge, though, is like you said, in ancient times, they would actually they could be at the gymnasium, they could work out together, be healthy, and see each other face to face. That's not so much there right now. But those communities are forming. People are forming communities or trying to do so. And so I think maybe in 5, 10 years, who knows what it looks like. But we now have an international bit of technology that allows everyone to communicate together and butt heads, or to join up to schools, or to just essentially practice philosophy in a way that I think was missing since late antiquity, or antiquity, basically. So now we have that ability for all these diverse schools, butt heads all over the world, and practice philosophy every single day if we want to. Now we need the ability to also build a community and be healthy and all that stuff. But maybe that'll happen in 5, 10 years. Who knows? But I'm really glad there are channels like yours that make sure that technology is being used in this fashion for us to all connect, practice philosophy, and argue at times, just like the ancients argued. It's like the ancient world born again. It's beautiful in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of like we are reading and studying these ancient people, wise people, and if we allow it, we can sort of channel their
Yeah, we
wisdom
will be there.
through ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, what would these wise people be like if they were to appear here and become aware of the internet and proficient in its use? How would they approach it? You know,
Some of them would be trolls. Some of them would
of
have
course,
a
of
responsible
yeah,
YouTube channel.
of course. But
Yeah.
imagine these guys that were superbly adept at figuring out how human nature works and perfecting it, encountering trolls and just being good natured about them, kind of like responding them jokingly, and so the trolls don't become very amused because they can't trigger them.
I mean, troll is kind of one of those words that sometimes has a negative interpretation, sometimes just has a sort of a controversial or contrarian nature. So I meant it more like a troll, like a contrarian, like a
Yeah,
Socrates or an Antisthenes or Diogenes, if you want to say he was real. So I meant troll like a contrarian. You'd have a bunch of contrarians online that might post something smart after, I don't know, Elon Musk or someone, and everyone would laugh. I mean,
yeah,
it really is like we can be like them, and we are like them. We're all people. They were people, we are people, and we now have this great way to butt heads and do philosophy that they didn't have, but they had something similar. And I think it's really amazing. I didn't have it prior to having the internet, so. But I think people prior to the internet did have something like it in churches and the like.
yeah,
I never really attended a church regularly. I've never been a Christian or going to church, but I've been into a church and I've talked to people who go to church, and I think they got something similar to that. I don't know all about it, not having gone there, but I think that was sort of similar. An ability to talk about philosophy and worldviews was they went to church each week, and maybe they had like a study group or a book group where they discussed sections of the Bible. I'm sure other religions have something similar, but now we have, or if we don't want to do that, we have this modern technology, which much more reminds me of the ancient world, of all these different competing schools and thinkers who could gather people to follow them and to discuss philosophy with them and to clash heads publicly with other people's philosophies and try to come up with, all these exciting new worldviews. It's like every year there's going to be a new worldview out there, and we can see if it has any merit or it doesn't. And it's amazing.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's great. And to go back to the initial question, perhaps the best way to approach knowing, whether it is about the stage in which everything operates in the unit of being, which is a fairly interesting ontology, or whether one ethical system is better than the other. The best way is really to question things, to never stop questioning. I like to think that assertions are great, but people can assert things and grab them like they were the last thing on earth, the most precious truth, and they're grabbing something that is not self-consistent, and it doesn't really work and will bring more harm than good. While if we stay with the questions more patiently and keep building up our data, our evidence diligently, methodically, getting inspired by these patient guys of science, people of science that repeat stuff, repeat experiments, however many times they need, and however many people independently repeating them, whether it's experiments in the physical world with the physical science or natural philosophy, or whether we are trying to do experiments in how would an ideal society work, how would people, how would the ideal human be like? How could we describe the ideal human? How could we describe the ideal cosmological worldview? So I think all these things, all these pursuits are very worthwhile. They have an endless bounty of riches for us to improve ourselves and the world in which we live in. And so I think it's might be a good angle to approach this.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about ethics and Aristotle earlier. I mean, any sort of natural law philosopher, I suppose, is going to go down this track of indicating when is a human being flourishing, when are they diminished or in pain, and whether we're going to be hedonists or whether we're going to posit some other system. There are ways to bring this observation or scientific ways into some of these topics. So you can easily tell whether an organism is being, well fed and is growing and developing in a way that is strengthening it, and that they desire. You can view the way an organism moves or the way its will is directed, and then you can also see what repulses it, and you can also see how outside things or diseases may affect it, or lack of nutrition causes it to change and suffer in many cases. And so I wouldn't say do experiments where you see what causes an animal pain, but I just mean, yeah, as you think more, you can construct these systems where it all sort of coheres, and you can have a testable, I guess you don't want to torture people, but you have some sort of way of measuring or showing beyond your words what is true. And so in my moral thinking, I tend to a sort of a biological or natural law sort of theory, where I'm just saying, change or morality is really based in will. And so the frustration of the will is going to be evil, and sort of the success or continued process or practice of the will, where it's doing what it wants to be doing, is a good. And then, of course, you get into questions of competing wills and have a sort of principle of harmony and trying to make a system where we can all be what we are and satisfy our will or our directions, without disrupting others, although it's always going to be imperfect because we are what we are. And that can kind of be measured. You can say, look, obviously, if that person went over to his neighbor who was being too loud and punched him in the face, that guy now has a broken face, and clearly he's suffering, and he didn't want to get punched. He tried to avoid it. There's some sort of evil there, some sort of clash, some, inharmonious behavior. So that's like an off the top of my head example, but you can kind of connect the physical world or practical world of individual experiences into a general system, and you can demonstrate it. But basically, this person said, morality is real, or there's good and evil, and I can prove it. Look, if I put my hand on the oven or on a stove top when it's lit, I'll burn my hand, and that hurts, and that's bad. And even if I want to say that's good, I can never say it's good because I'm going to draw my hand away. It's burning. But also, we could criticize that because one, I mean, technically, there are people that put their hand in fire and didn't budge, like the Roman soldier who snuck into the camp. And when he got captured, he was brought ahead of the king, and he put his hand in the fire and said, Rome's going to win. And the guy was very impressed and wanted to make peace after that, saying, look at this soldier. But I suppose, though, that infers that putting your hand in fire is a bad thing, and he was able to sustain it. But more importantly, what if everyone watching the person finds it funny that they put their hand on the stove? Like the guy says, I'm going to put my hand on the stove. And it's going to prove that it's evil because I'll have to wrench it back because it will hurt. Sticks his hand on the stove, wrenches it back. And everyone laughed at him and thinks that guy's an idiot. Well, then they all got pleasure. So was it really bad that the guy put his hand on the stove? He suffered some pain. Everyone else found it funny and suffered some pleasure. So, and that's not to say that this is a very serious or well presented conclusion to the case, but it's like there's many things to discuss and to think about, and it does involve physical and practical events. And I think you're right that science, or at least this process of experimentation or seeing things play out, has like a big role for stuff like morality and ethics, and can inform the system, even on these questions that some will think like you can't legislate morality or whatever the saying is. Well, you can observe it. You can observe morality if we're defining morality in these ways, and that's what we're looking at and trying to figure out. Like if we're trying to figure out what humans are and what they do, and that's the subject of morality, then we're going to see the practices that attract and repulse them and everything, and try and make a system and test it.
Well, I think we should think about a future discussion on. There are many possibilities considering both of our backgrounds and what we really like to discuss.
Yeah, if you ever wind up reading my website or anything like that, let me know what you think about it. If there's anything you would change or correct. I mean, it's a work.
Sure.
I've updated it many times, and people do reach out now and again, and they say, "Hey, we like this," or "I didn't like that, and this is why." And then I go and think about it and figure it out. And
Yeah.
likewise, I follow your tweets. I mean, I think we're mutuals on Twitter,
Yeah.
and so yeah.
I like that you have the self-awareness, that you don't claim to be the end-all, be-all, end-all interpreter of these philosophies of Parmenides or the others. Which it's a really healthy position to be. You don't claim your worldviews or any other philosophical concepts to be finished and kind of set in stone. It's a pursuit it's a work in progress, whatever we are doing in philosophy. So it's really insightful and inspiring to talk with someone like you. And I would also like to say for the people watching to check out your Twitter. Adam is called Tweetophon on Twitter. I will link below in the description. There's also a really interesting website Adam created, which is a Neo-Eleatic Monism text, which is organized and structured like a choose your own story kind of book. You can either experience it as a website or download it as a PDF, and the links will work, and you will basically traverse this world that you've constructed, like a kind of like an RPG in which you are an explorer exploring this Eleatic temple. I had the opportunity to check it out, not thoroughly yet, but if I get the time, I will surely give you feedback. And
yeah,
so
maybe you'll disagree with everything in there, but either way, feedback is always valuable.
Sure. So thanks, Adam, and see you next time.
Yeah,
Bye.
see you next time. Thank you. Bye.